And welcome to lecture 29, in which we are going to continue to study Asia. And we're going to look at India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, North and South Korea. So let's pull up a map and show you where those places are. All right, here's the map of Asia that we are being using, and this is one you'll be tested on. And across the top, we have the giant country of, you guessed it, Russia. Okay, we got Russia up there. We all know what this one is. Okay, we got China. China, of course, claims the island of Taiwan right there. We know this is Mongolia. Over here, we have the five stands. And the little memory aid that we use is the K's on top. This is Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. T's on the bottom. We have Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and oozing between them all is Uzbekistan right there. Okay. We have looked at Japan, which is right up here. So this, of course, is the Sea of Japan. We talked about the Philippines, which are right here. We looked at Vietnam, the long skinny one. We looked at Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, used to be called Burma. We have Malaysia in two pieces. We have the incredibly wealthy Sultanate of Brunei, this little dot right there. We have the very successful and wealthy Singapore, that little dot right there. And then we have Indonesia, which you can't see all of on this map. Indonesia is all of this and a whole bunch of islands that you can't see. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Here we have the South China Sea. Over here we have the Indian Ocean. Here we have the Persian Gulf. Here we have Iran. So you can see that we have almost covered all of Asia. All right, today we are going to look at Bangladesh, which is this little country right here. We're going to look at India, which is this giant country right here. We're going to look at Pakistan and North and South Korea up here. North being this one, South being this one, because North is at the top of the map, South is at the bottom. We know all of that. Okay, so Bangladesh right there, India, Pakistan, North Korea right up here, South Korea right there. All right, now, normally when I teach these, I teach them on, takes about a week to do it, and we don't have time to do that in this truncated form of online. So rather than my talking about these, and I love lecturing on these, I'm going to show you two little short video clips. The video clips do a pretty good job of talking about the two areas. I'm going to take a look at first on Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Talks about how these become three different countries. So let's take a look at this one.
India and Pakistan have hated each other for 70 years. Here's why. The British ran India for more than 2 centuries, and it would be a bit of an understatement to say that Indians weren't happy about it. All the country's rage was directed at the British. To put a stop to that, India's colonizers had an idea: divide and rule. What does that mean? Pit Muslims against Hindus, against Sikhs, against Christians. To put minorities in positions of power over majorities. The idea was, if they're fighting each other, they're not fighting us. Ingenious, right? This isn't to say that Indians didn't fight over religion before the British came, but it was the first time that this was a result of policy. Religion became more important than language and ethnicity, and mistrust between religious communities became the norm. It trickled up to Indian politicians like the Muslim League's Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who talked about having a separate Muslim state if the British were to ever leave. Then World War I began. The British promised to leave India if Indians fought for them. They fought, but independence didn't happen. 2 decades later, it was World War II. Again, there was a promise of independence in return for troops. This time, leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, who would later be India's first Prime Minister, said no. Jinnah, the Muslim League leader, wanted British support for a new Muslim country, so he convinced Indian Muslims to fight. If you wondered what Indians were doing at Dunkirk, now you know. By the time World War II ended, it was clear that the British were going to leave. Many Muslims began to fear living under a Hindu majority in a democratic India, and many Hindus were angry that Muslims wanted to break up the country. This descended into brutal acts like killings, forced conversions, arson, abductions, rape, and ethnic cleansing. It all came to a head in Kolkata in August 1946. 4,000 Hindus were killed in the Great Calcutta killings. This scared the British, and they promised to leave India in 1948. But their exit from India was not going to be clean or peaceful. The religious divisions they had stoked had turned into an inferno. Jinnah seized this opportunity and demanded a separate Muslim state. Nehru, also scared by the violence, reluctantly agreed. Gandhi opposed it, but it was too late. Jinnah's supporters were in no mood to debate. Thinking they'd fix things, the British announced they would leave in August 1947, a year earlier than planned. This is the man who was brought in to divide the Indian Empire. Cyril Ratcliffe, a British lawyer who had never been anywhere east of Paris. He was given one job: draw borders that would break up India, taking into account religion and other things like railways and irrigation canals. Ratcliffe was given only 36 days to do the job. He finished 3 days ahead of schedule, but the lines that created West Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan were kept a secret until after independence. Ratcliffe didn't quite finish his job, though. He didn't draw a line for Kashmir. What could possibly go wrong, right? On August 14, Pakistan gained independence. India gained independence the next day. Partition had become a reality. If you think the story has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention. Here's the catastrophe that Ratcliffe's lines created on the ground. 7 million people moved from India to Pakistan. 7 million more went from Pakistan to India. 1 million were killed in the process, murdered, starved, and poisoned. Mobs lynched trains full of men, women, and children, and families have been split apart to this day. The militaries of the two countries were practically useless while this was going on. Soldiers were busy figuring out their own lives. The dust from August 1947 has yet to settle. Since then, India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars over Kashmir and 1 over East Pakistan, which eventually became Bangladesh. Both countries still fight over disputed borders and water, and both are nuclear powers. Even cricket matches between them are politically charged. And over 70 years, the divide between people who look the same, speak the same, dress the same, eat the same food, and make the same music has become even deeper.
Okay, so there you have a messy, messy situation. They do not get along. However, we have not had a real big war since both of them got nukes. We have had border skirmishes, mostly around that Kashmir area up there, but nobody's done a really big war. You don't go to war with a nuclear power. So that's kind of a silver lining to nuclear weapons. Yeah, maybe. Okay, let's take a look now at the little video on North and South Korea. We do have nuclear weapons involved with North Korea. They have the bomb. South Korea does not, depending on the United States to defend them. Let's take a quick look at this video.
Have you ever wondered why there's North Korea and South Korea? Ever wondered what happened to, Korea? Like most geopolitical changes in the world, the division of Korea was the result of war. The Korean War took place from 1950 to 1953, but it wasn't really the Korean War that split the country. The Korean War just made the split more permanent, but it was already split. We need to look not only at the Korean War, but look at the bigger picture. The split had more to do with the Cold War. The Cold War is interesting in that it wasn't so much a war in the traditional sense. The Cold War was effectively a war of wars. The Cold War was primarily between the United States and the Soviet Union, but in a more broad sense it was effectively an ideological war between capitalism and communism. The US and the USSR never actually fought each other in direct battle, but instead fought each other indirectly through proxy wars. One example would be the Vietnam War. The United States, who were helping South Vietnam, were at war with communist North Vietnam, while the Soviets provided them with tanks, aircraft and weapons, as well as billions of dollars in funding. Another example would be the Soviet war in Afghanistan. The Soviets fought with the communist Afghan government, while the United States gave $3 billion in funding to the Mujahideen to fight in the civil war. However, this turned out to be a horrible decision for the US, as one of the leaders of the Mujahideen turned out to be one Osama bin Laden, who later went on to form Al-Qaeda, who later went on to declare war on the United States. So in a roundabout way, the US effectively funded terrorism against themselves. But back to Korea. The Korean War is effectively another one of these proxy wars as part of the Cold War. But the split Korea happened even before the Cold War. The country was actually split at the end of World War II. If you've seen my first video, I talked about how Japan surrendered in World War II and had to give up land that they had acquired via force by signing the Potsdam Declaration, which included Taiwan. As well as Taiwan though, Japan also had control of the entire Korean peninsula, which the Japanese Empire had annexed in 1910 from the Korean Empire. The Japanese ruled Korea for 35 years before their surrender. But this is different from the situation with Taiwan. Taiwan's an island which made up a tiny amount of the Republic of China's land, so it's simply a case of handing sovereignty over to China. But with Korea, Japan took all of their land, so the Korean Empire had effectively been wiped off the map. Therefore, by order of the United Nations, Korea was to be temporarily split at the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union were to control the north while the United States controlled the south, with a plan to unite the country in time. It's important to note that at this point the US and the USSR were allies at this time, although they didn't exactly trust each other. The United Nations scheduled elections in both parts of Korea. They were to be fair and democratic. In the south, Syngman Rhee was elected and the Republic of Korea was established, taking control over from the US military. However, in the north, the Soviet Union refused to hold free elections and a communist state was established with Kim Il-sung as the leader of the country, grandfather of the current North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. By 1949, all US and Soviet forces had withdrawn from Korea. The Soviets and Communist China had significantly armed the North Koreans with weapons and funding. The US, on the other hand, they weren't quite so generous with the South Koreans and refused to even give them any tanks, leaving them seriously ill-equipped for a war. And war is exactly what happened. In 1950, under the direction of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Stalin didn't expect the US to get involved since he had already withdrawn all of their troops and they didn't intervene in the victory of Communist China and the Chinese Civil War in the previous year. However, the UN Security Council unanimously voted to intervene in Korea. Ironically though, the Soviet Union was part of the UN Security Council's Big Five and had veto power. Unfortunately for them, they weren't there to veto the resolution. See, even though Communist China had effectively won the Civil War and had total control of the mainland, the Republic of China, who only had control of Taiwan, still held the seat of China at the UN. In protest of this, the Soviet Union boycotted all UN meetings. So the UN intervened to protect South Korea, although it's mostly US forces. The troops were led by the United States under the command of General MacArthur. Stalin promised to help North Korea as much as possible, however, he insisted that Soviet forces would not engage in combat with US forces. But why is this, you might wonder? I mean, why engage in all these proxy wars and indirect fighting? Why don't the United States and Soviet Union just fight each other directly? Well, the answer to that can be summed up in 3 words: mutually assured destruction. See, at the time, the US and the USSR were considered the 2 superpowers of the world, and the consequences of both superpowers at all-out war with each other would have had catastrophic repercussions. As well as being superpowers, they were also both nuclear weapon states. See, in the early 40s, the US, with the help of the UK and Canada, worked on the Manhattan Project, which is basically codename for developing an atomic bomb. It's a slightly more conspicuous name. In 1945, the US showed the sheer destructive power of these weapons when they dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After seeing this, the Soviet Union significantly increased their own research into nuclear weapons, and in 1949, they successfully tested their own atomic bomb. So war between the United States and the Soviet Union would have inevitably ended in World War III, and for the first time, nuclear war. This wouldn't have just been bad for the US and Russia, but absolutely, literally, everyone, and could have quite easily led to the end of human civilization. But thankfully that didn't happen. Joseph Stalin was fully aware of the potential consequences of engaging in combat with US forces. Say what you want about Joseph Stalin, but at least he was smart enough not to go to war with the US. Credit where credit's due, that's all I'm saying. By September 1950, North Korea had South Korea cornered in the Pusan perimeter and a communist victory looked imminent. The North Koreans had to send supplies to their soldiers on the front line, which General MacArthur thought he could exploit. Instead of trying to break through with ground forces, the US used their navy to flank the North Koreans. They took back control of the city of Seoul and managed to disrupt the North Korean supply line. Within just a few months, things had completely changed and it now looked like South Korea was on the verge of victory. However, at this point, China, who had thus far not been involved, marched their troops across the border and pushed the UN forces back to the 38th parallel. Control of the peninsula fluctuated for a while around the 38th parallel. Ironically, control ended very similar to what it had been to begin with. In 1953, North and South Korea signed an armistice agreement creating a de facto international border. It's worth noting that an armistice agreement is not a peace treaty, so technically speaking, they're actually still at war. After the agreement, both sides built barriers to stop each other from crossing the border, and there's now a 4-kilometre wide demilitarised zone, which is a somewhat ironic name given it's the single most militarised border in the entire world. Speaking of ironic names, North Korea's official name is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is ironic since several organisations have ranked North Korea as the single least democratic country in the entire world. And the good thing about talking about North Korea is no one's going to be offended. I can safely say that no one from North Korea is ever going to see this video. In 1991, both North and South Korea became members of the United Nations, although neither country recognises the other and both consider themselves the legitimate government of all of Korea. The only place where North and South Korean leaders meet is inside the DMZ in a place called the Joint Security Area. The JSA, including the room they meet in, lie directly on the border, which isn't actually a border but an MDL or an armistice line. In fact, the line even passes through the very conference table they sit at. So the two leaders basically talk to each other from different countries and don't cross the line. There's a door at each side of the room which leads back to their own country. Today, North Korea and South Korea are pretty much as different as two countries can be. They both speak Korean and they both have the word Korea in their name, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. South Korea has a free market capitalist economy, while North Korea officially describes itself as a socialist republic, but a more accurate description might be a totalitarian dictatorship. So if you're planning on going on holiday to Korea, you're probably better off going to South Korea.
Okay, yeah, nobody wants to go to North Korea. This is a rather famous photograph from the space stations. Up here you see North Korea at night, no lights. South Korea all lit up. Over here, China all lit up. This mass of lights right here is Seoul, South Korea. Yeah, it's a screwed up place, North Korea. When I was in South Korea, I was got to sit in on an intelligence briefing on North Korea, and one fact just jumped out at me. Due to malnutrition up there, the average height of a North Korean is about 1.5 inches shorter than the average height of a South Korean. And this is with the countries only being separated for 70 years or so. Yeah, it is not a happy place to live in North Korea. Okay, so we will jump on to the last day of our look at Asia. Tomorrow, we'll look at Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bhutan. So, hey, study your countries. See you around campus.